they would not have considered in the past. And if they find them more convenient, more enjoyable, or better value, then they will stick with them. The other threat comes from salience, if your salience declines versus the competition. So if you think about something like the alcohol category, yes, salience is likely to decrease, but probably for all brands. So you need to measure yourself against what's happening in your category during lockdown. But I think what has become more worrying from a brand viewpoint is the recession that the lockdown has triggered. So it seems likely that many categories will take years to fully recover. And even when those restrictions lift, the fear factor will determine how fast demand recovers. So the recession will force additional trading down. It's probably going to force people to postpone some purchases. It's going to shift demand. So for instance, when people's wages are squeezed, car purchases are going to be postponed. We saw last night on the news that Toyota forecast an 80% down on their revenue for this year. And also people will replace true luxury with affordable luxuries. And I believe they call that a lipstick economy. And in this environment, in this recessionary environment, categories and brands will battle for share of people's diminished wallets. And then finally, we can expect recovery. So it's not maybe the new normal, but it's the next normal. And when we reach that recovery phase or the next normal, brand desire will start to stabilize. We'll see things settle back. We'll see the status quo return. And then the only disruption that will happen is when brands actually disrupt with some sort of innovation. So keeping those three things in mind, it might seem strange that I start with recovery, but this is the ideal that everybody wants to get back to. And I think we need to equip ourselves to navigate through the lockdown and the recession with the end goal in sight. So as we face a new recession, and potentially one that is a lot bigger scale than that we saw in 2008, we can actually look back at the Great Recession that started in 2008 to guide our responses to this one. So we have a wealth of information. And first I'm going to show you this very cluttered chart, lots of data today. But this chart is based on a Harvard Business Review article, and that article is titled Roaring Out of the Recession. And what they did here is they did an analysis and they looked back at the Great Recession in 2008, and they looked at the probability that companies would significantly outperform their rivals. So significantly, they decided would be 10% or more, both on the top and bottom line growth after the recession. So they classified those companies as prevention, promotion, pragmatic, and progressive. And the prevention guys, these companies just quickly implemented policies that reduced operating costs through cost containment. So they did save cash through their actions, but they tended to end up with lower quality and very low staff morale, and that undermined customer satisfaction. Then we had the promotion companies. They did the complete opposite. They pressed on with all their growth plans, but they didn't listen to consumers. They didn't actually listen to what their consumers needed and how their consumer needs had changed in this period. Then the pragmatic companies, they pursued a more balanced strategy of both cutting and investing. But if we look at the last bucket of the progressives, these are the guys that focus both on operational efficiency, and they also invested in their companies. So rather than simple cost cutting, they really looked at operational efficiencies, and the kind of investments they made for the future centered around innovation. They had increased availability. They came up with new production capabilities. They had new brand positioning where it was required. It's not always required, but they had that, or they increased share of voice against the competition, because the point is that in this environment, you really just need to make sure that you outperform your competitors. And I think a very important one that we like, especially for our industry, is the fact that they increased share of voice, because marketing spend is usually the first thing to go in difficult times. So if we look at lockdown, the big question, sorry, I need to move forward. The big question for brands is, how has lockdown affected your categories so far? And the impact of that will vary depending on whether your brand has been locked out, locked down, and locked in. So locked out, I think we are all very familiar with, especially those of us who miss our cigarettes and alcohol. So those categories have been essentially removed. Cigarettes, alcohol, hospitality, all of the events. Then locked down are people who have less need of a category. So automotive is one of those. Beauty, I put on like base and like a full face for the first time in weeks really today to look good for you guys. But we can see, you know, I think the locked in bucket is probably the bucket where we'll find yoga pant, where demand has increased. That's mostly staple consumer goods, indulgences, like little indulgences to make you feel good while you're locked in, food delivery, and home entertainment. So not only will lockdown change demand, it will change the purchase. Hello?
Stina, sorry to interrupt you just for a second. You're currently in show slide mode. Could you just click into the expanded mode if you can? Otherwise, let's see if it works. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, goodness. Oh no, that is blacking it.
Display settings at the top there, next to the one you're on. There we go. No. If it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. We can all see the screen very clearly. So it should be fine. Ah, voila. Well done. Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Stina.
Let me just reduce this. So the big question is, how much of this behavior will stick? How sticky is this behavior? And I think a lot has been said about this changed behavior. But what we actually see from a behavioral science point of view is that it's actually quite difficult to make sure that people's behavior change. A few months of changed behavior is not likely to have a long-term impact. Typically what we'll see is that when behavior is convenient or satisfying, when it's easy to maintain, those are the kinds of things that will actually stick, or the kind of behavior that is based on the contextual and societal, the social cues that will remain in effect. So if we see recurring waves of the virus, we're likely to see people continue washing their hands and continue to maintain a social distance. But as far as behavior around brands and categories go, we really need to make sure then that it is something that is way more convenient or satisfying. And if we look at this results from the COVID barometer, we can see that even in our latest wave of the South African COVID barometer, we can see that people are starting to get an inkling that they will probably not maintain their future online purchases as they ease into the fact that the shops are open and that they're used to the fact that shops are open. And we can see more proof of this if we look at what's been happening in China. So in China, we have seen some early signs that some of these changes might not last. So this is from this is a specific category that they looked at where we had increased online purchase in China. And you can see that online increased during the, increased vastly during the lockdown. But after, when everybody returned back to their normal way and the shops opened up, it didn't quite go back to the levels before of 31%. But you can see that it is beginning to stabilize and that people are not necessarily continuing their online shopping behavior. So I think we've found that people are notoriously bad at predicting what they will do next. So I've talked about the fact that brand desire remains steady, but there will be some winners and losers. And this example comes from the UK. And not surprising, we can see that brands like Dettol, Domestos, Andrax, these are all brands that have become very important to us during COVID. They've all gained value market share, and these are big brands and they're widely available. So we can see that the lockdown has put these brands in a very good position. But then there are also brands with a meaningful position that will benefit. And this was an interesting example where Lucozade actually outperformed Pepsi in terms of share gains during the lockdown. And this baffled everybody because Lucozade is an energy drink. So why would it suddenly outperform Pepsi? And what transpired is that this brand had a long heritage where people had used it to recover after illness. So they actually still had this residual perception that it is a recovery aid and that it's something that will help you recover after you've been sick. And therefore, Lucozade benefited from the lockdown. So it's very important to keep aligning your brand positioning and your brand association during this period. And it doesn't mean that you need to go outside of what you stand for, but look at whether that positioning and whether those associations resonate with where we are at the moment. Then earlier we talked about those brands that, those companies that won were the ones that continued investing. And unfortunately, we see most of the time that as soon as there's trouble, brands stop spending and they stop spending on their marketing. And this chart is not even, so this is not even from the recession. This is just during normal times, if any brand goes dark. Sounds terrible, but so when a brand goes dark, it means when we look at their TV advertising, and if they stop advertising for more than 6 months, we see this impact. And the first impact is obviously on advertising awareness. That's the biggest change where we see a decline. And then we see a decline in salience. So salience is how quickly this brand comes to mind and how mentally available the brand is. So you can see total mentions for a brand will fall, and that is mostly supported by spontaneous mentions. So people will not spontaneously think of these brands. The measures that we do see that are more stable is brand recognition or aided brand awareness. So if you show somebody a brand, those things will still be sticky. And then, of course, if that brand has a very firm, built up a very firm association and specific perceptions, those things are more durable. But it shows you how vulnerable brands are as soon as spending stops. So we need to continually make sure that our brands are visible and that they come to mind quickly. So what we've seen is that lockdown has caused significant shifts in media consumption. And I think none of this is surprising. If we think about how everybody has been locked in, how the demand on your time from WhatsApp and Facebook and everybody sending you messages, also people looking for information, of course, TV on demand. It was quite interesting that in the UK, when they looked at TV behavior, initially that was driven not so much by the younger audience, but as the lockdown wore on, we saw it increasingly shift to younger audiences, which, kind of, stick the kid in front of the TV to keep him occupied while you're on your Zoom meeting. But we've seen that most of these social measures and the traditional measures like radio and TV have seen a big increase, and people say that they've used them more in the last month. But what that of course means is that there were some media that was more that didn't get as many eyeballs. So we saw outdoor, we saw public transport, those touch points. Some stores would have been affected. Cinema, of course. So what they've done here is looked at 3 scenarios. So these are 2 brands. The one is a brand in Europe and the other one is a brand in Asia. Because the question is now, if some touch points have more focus and other touch points have less or hardly any focus, surely it seems like the most logical thing to just simply cut my spend in those areas where I'm not getting eyeballs, because then I'm going to have a big saving. What we're looking at here are the three scenarios and the effect that it had on brand equity share. And you can see that there are similar results for the three scenarios. So in scenario one, what they simulated for these brands to do was typically just stop advertising in those touch points where we're not seen. So just take that money and run. And you can see that that actually affected the brand equity in both countries and for both brands. Then in the second scenario, they stopped the investment in the affected touch points, but then they just optimized the investment on the remaining touch points. And you can see that that had not such a big impact, so it kind of maintained. But what actually had the biggest impact was to take investment from those touch points where we were not getting the attention that we used to, and actually reallocate it to the remaining touch points. So this just tells you to not make rash decisions. It would be best to take an informed view of how to redistribute your marketing spend right now. So you need to make sure that you are still in the right channels, but also with the right content. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because the Queen of Creative entertained you last week around the fact that creative quality is the single largest driver of brand impact in paid media specifically. So creative quality can have a massive impact. And especially now, people are a lot more sensitized to what you put out there. Is it appropriate? Is it genuine? Is it authentic? And given all of that, it is surprising that we are still not giving that much attention to the quality of creative that we are putting out there. From the barometer, we see that 91% of South Africans say that their ads should talk about how they could be helpful in the new everyday life. And yet we've seen this flood of emotional support ads. They're just generic ads. They don't tell us how this brand is going to help us. They just this ad that tells us, oh, we've been here for you. We are also people. We'll always be here for you. And typically we stick the brand at the end and it's not very distinctive. And it just blends into this white noise of all these brands that tell us the same thing. So I'm going to try and play my video for you now. Paula, I hope I fixed it. I did try last night and test it. So please flag me if you can't hear the sound.
Working.
Yay.
When we first opened our doors.
Since 1926.
Since 1978.
For 60 years.
For 75 years.
For over 80 years.
In 90 years.
Over 100 years.
Nationwide has been on your side.
Restaurants have always been there for you.
Nissan has been with you through thick and thin.
We will do what we've always done.
Take care of people.
We're people.
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 People. People.
People and family.
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 Family. Family.
Family.
Family.
Family.
Family.
Families are families.
Families.
Even now. Especially now.
Especially now.
Right now.
Now more than ever.
More than ever.
Today, more than ever.
Today, more than ever.
In times like this.
At times like these.
During these difficult times.
In these troubled times.
Challenging times.
Trying times.
In these times of uncertainty.
During this time of great uncertainty.
During these uncertain times.
During these uncertain times.
I'm just going to stop it there. You get the drift. And I'm pretty sure you've seen some of these ads on South African TV, and some of our local guys were quick off the bat to make something very similar to this. And it's a trap that our brands should not fall into. They should actually be offering practical help to consumers. Oops. So let's go on to recession. And what we saw under the recession topic was that price points are coming under increasing pressure, and people are becoming a lot more price sensitive. In South Africa, you would have seen last week, and this becomes even more pronounced as we move through wave 3 through to wave 3 of our barometer, that people are more concerned about their financial position in South Africa than about their personal health. Only 50% are worried about falling sick, but nearly 80%, and that keeps increasing, are worried about being more proactive about financial planning and how long the economy is going to take to recover. So these financial concerns are real, and we can see that people have actually already been impacted. So those are about 66% have been impacted, and that's up from our last wave by 10%. And that's making people more price sensitive. The other impact that has is that they are delaying or stopping purchases in a range of categories. So obviously things like holidays and car maintenance are going to suffer. In South Africa, we can't even necessarily buy home appliances, but they're definitely thinking of postponing some of those purchases. The things that will stick, of course, are access to the internet and to our entertainment. And I was looking for this Maslow's pyramid because I remember that somebody had stuck Wi-Fi or the internet at the bottom of Maslow. And I came across this one, which actually also has toilet paper added on, now that it's become so important in our lives. But what does this mean? Will people absolutely go for the lowest price? And that's not necessarily the truth. So we look in our Brand Z database that looks at brand equity and how strong brands are. We ask people whether they buy on brand and then on price, or on price more than brand. And we see in over 50% of the categories, people typically opt for brand first and then price. So people definitely are prepared to pay more for a strong brand. And we saw this when we combined our Brand Z equity data with panel shopper data. And we looked at people who said that they are brand driven and then they buy from a repertoire. So obviously then people who are more price driven will buy on price. But even people who are price driven, if you look at this chart, it shows that even people who are price driven, they are prepared to pay slightly more if a brand has high meaningful difference. So that means that your brand needs to not be easily substitutable. You need to demonstrate what the value of your brand is. And you need to give them a reason to pay that little extra if you play in this space. It's a very dangerous place to get into discounting and promotions all the time. And then you just, consumers become used to having those discounts and those promotions all the time, and you can never gain back what you've lost due to playing on price all of the time. It's a much better game to justify why you are worth paying a little bit more for. So to summarize, I've got 5 key takeouts. We saw that companies that seek operational efficiencies and invest for the future are the ones that are more likely to come back strong during the recovery, and that a few weeks of enforced changes are unlikely to make us change our behavior, unless there's something that's more convenient or satisfying or easy to maintain. Then you need to continue building a meaningful position to carry you through the recession. You need to give people a reason to believe. And if that can somehow align to what is happening in people's lives, all the better. You need to be in the right channels with quality creative. And lastly, people are prepared to pay more for meaningfully different brands. So you need to make sure that you can justify that little bit of price premium that you charge over your competitors, or even if it is a lot, but you need to communicate to people, because if they're going to decide where to spend their money, then that is going to be crucial that you have that competitive edge. So last, I'm going to leave you with a quote that I've been told is usually attributed to Darwin, but it just talks to the fact that we need to understand our consumer behavior. We need to understand how we should adapt and how we should be agile to make sure that we position our brands as best we can to come through these trying times. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stina. Hope you can all hear me again. That was fantastic. I think I can say thank you on behalf of everyone, and we look forward to the Q&A a bit later. Please remember to share your questions. They won't pop up on the group line. They'll come directly to me, and then we'll have a chat with Stina a bit later. Still got some people joining, which is exciting. We've also just had Charlene Van Rooyen from Woolworths join us. So I'm going to do an introduction to Charlene and just make sure that I can unmute. Let's just get to that. So Charlene, if you can just bear with me for a few seconds while I do a quick intro. There, we've unmuted you. Welcome, Charlene.
Great, thanks.
Oh, super. So Charlene Van Rooyen, for those of you who do not know her yet, is the head of customer at Woolworths, and Charlene's been there for almost 3 years, I think, under. Charlene previously was at Vodacom, SAB Miller, and Standard Bank, just for the last, if I look at the last few years, but has always been very focused on strategic expertise in customer loyalty and bringing those insights to the fore. So a huge thank you for joining us, Charlene. It's fantastic to get a brand's perspective. And I believe that we are specifically going to meet Neo today. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So just a bit of context in terms of Neo and the chatbots. So we started experimenting with chatbots last year, toward the end of last year. And it was more to get an understanding of customer behavior when it came to eating habits and how they interacted with food in South Africa. And it really was just an experiment to see if people would complete a 7-day food diary. We had an overwhelming number of people that completed it. But through that, we actually realized that this methodology really gets to the meat of customers' emotions, and it removes a lot of biases. It removes a lot of this very rational reporting by consumers when they answer very structured questions. So it does make the analysis a bit more tricky. But what you get to is very much this conversation with consumers where they really give you a sense of what they're feeling, and you get to the drivers and the whys behind their behavior. And what we find, and you'll see with the different chatbots, we actually design them quite specifically in terms of being very, very personable, very neutral, very much something that's not intimidating. And what we find is customers actually love interacting with the bot. They love talking with the bot. So when it came to COVID, we, I think like all of you, have been inundated with lots of reports, both international as well as local, in terms of how customers are feeling in general. But for our perspective, we needed a much deeper dive in terms of how are they behaving from a shopping context and what really are those drivers. So hence Neo was born. It's quite fascinating because Caroline from Kantar, she basically gave me a call and said, well, let's now do a chatbot version to understand COVID in more detail. It literally was turned around in 3 to 4 days. In terms of just coding this bot with different responses that we want, we launched it via Facebook Messenger, and we launched it the day before Easter. So we actually launched it on the day of the extended lockdown announcement. It was very opportune timing to get a sense of how South Africans were feeling. And we wanted to understand broadly what was the sentiment in the country in terms of South Africans' attitudes toward the lockdown, how they were feeling. We also wanted to get a sense and understanding in terms of how are they behaving, what are their drivers, and we did this in response to giving them certain statements that they could then discuss and respond to, rather than asking them very structured questions. And I'm not going to share too much of the details. That's why I haven't done a big slide deck on this, because some of the information is proprietary. But what I can share, and I think a lot of you have been exposed to this, is people's initial response was fairly positive in terms of the president doing the right thing, in terms of locking the country down. But what came hand in hand with that was a deep concern for the economy. So a deep concern in terms of where South Africa was heading from an economic point of view. And that took two sides, actually. The one was very much a concern for the poorer communities, so people not being able to access food. And what came out quite a lot is, and it's an insight, I suppose, which is very true of this country, is that so many people, they don't have monthly salaries. So they literally live on either a daily wage or a weekly wage. A lot of people also don't have the facilities in their homes to store food. So yes, you had this panic buying by one half of the economy, but you had the other half of the economy who are used to buying their food on a daily basis. So a lot of consumers were commenting on that because they saw it within their community. So deep, deep concern in terms of people actually being able to have access to food, as well as a deep concern for small businesses and local. A lot of activity on social media around all these small businesses that were impacted, that didn't have the capital or the cash flow to be able to ride this wave, to be able to ride the lockdown. So there was very much this, customers were feeling a bit sad from an emotional point of view and worried, but the deeper concern was actually an external concern in terms of the economy in general. But what you then find is customers then started going a bit more in terms of their own emotional roller coaster. So we first start with a safer territory, which is how do you feel about the economy? How do you feel about things around you? And then they start talking about things that are impacting them directly. And a term which is quite interesting, which I think many people would have seen in social media, is something called Corona coaster. And it's very, very true. So you have the spectrum of emotions in terms of people being very positive and also going into a very negative space. The balance, however, is negative. So even though you had some of these moments of positivity where people they're now at home, they're getting to do things they've never done before, they're getting to spend time with their families, with their children, they're getting to reconnect. You then have these waves in terms of then going into the negative, back in terms of financial concerns, work concerns. A large majority of people were starting to experience a wage cut or weren't actually getting a salary during this period. So as much as there were a few positives, you started going into the negative fairly quickly. So it was quite interesting to see how customers were riding this sort of Corona coaster, and through riding that, you then had different needs emerging in terms of what they were looking for, both from a content point of view at home as well as a shopping perspective. So I think that's where you find a lot of this. Netflix, of course, went through the roof in terms of subscriptions, a lot of more content being consumed by people in the home. And you also find a lot of this, almost this need to treat. And I think we go right back to Maslow, since the only thing that was available was food really during this period. You have this constant snacking which came through. And quite a big overindulgence over Easter. Because you had this negativity of emotion, people were looking for some way to find some kind of joy or some kind of highlight. But what came hand in hand with that, and it's quite interesting because you have customers have always referenced with us all these different diets and eating plans that they go on, the gluten-free and the carb-conscious and the rest of it. But what Corona was doing was putting more of a focus on healthy eating when it comes to immunity. So a lot of trends that were coming out was in terms of how do I eat healthier to boost my immune system and protect my health. So it put a whole different spin on what healthy eating actually meant. And we found because of the period we ran it over, you have this overindulgence over Easter in terms of people wanting to at least take back some kind of celebration and some kind of enjoyment. And then right thereafter, going back to, okay, I need to return to some kind of health to be able to equip myself as much as possible against this thing which is coming. And if you look at just at a total level, the period that we ran this over, I would say there were two big, broad themes that came out of this. One, and I'm going to talk about shopping behavior in a minute, but one of them was this profound sense of loss. And that sense of loss was both tangible, so either financial loss, a loss in terms of health, a loss even in terms of loved ones, because you had quite a bit of death during this period as well, not necessarily COVID-related death, but you had death through the normal course and people couldn't do funerals, etc. So you had this loss, tangible loss, but also loss in terms of a way of life. So as much as you had all these new things coming in, people cooking from home, people exercising from home, people having time with their kids, they were missing how they used to live. And this loss was thrust upon people. It wasn't something that they came to a realization of gradually. And then linking to that sense of loss in terms of how we used to live was a sense of powerlessness. So people really didn't have the ability to be able to take control of the situation. Some who were more positive created, their new routines, their new exercise routines, their new eating routines. But what we'll find is that the longer this continues, that positivity also starts to erode. And people are wanting some form of being able to take back control and return to a new normal. Now, given that insight, when we look specifically, which was of importance to us, how people are changing in terms of their shopping behavior, what was interesting is before it was announced that face masks were mandatory for everyone to wear, it came through quite strongly where the perception with consumers was a face mask equals safety. So when they were choosing where to go shop, as soon as they saw face masks, it cued it was safer for them to go into that environment. So where you found your drivers of shopping behavior were usually price or who had the best promotions, now that driver was very much, it needs to be very close to home because I don't want to go out, and it needs to be as safe as possible. And that safety aspect is also what now spurred on the online behavior. So we've been looking at e-commerce in this country for quite a long time in terms of a slower curve than we've seen in overseas markets. That's now accelerated because we've introduced that need. Now customers are playing around with a lot of different online players. They're finding a few issues in terms of navigation because they've never really explored these environments. And some are really enjoying the experience of just being able to sit at home and have things delivered to them. Because one of the barriers to online shopping, well, there was actually two big barriers in the country. One was a concern around how safe is it from a payments point of view. I think with a lot of the measures the banks and different websites have taken, that's more or less been mitigated. The other big barrier was, well, I'm not really sure I'm going to be at home and nobody's going to be able to take delivery. Now you've got a captive audience of people sitting at home, so deliveries can come as often as possible. And we're finding quite a lot in terms of that online shopping has had this resurrection. And it's interesting in terms of how many, what customers were browsing and what they were even trying to reserve for delivery after lockdown. And if you look to the point that customers are now not buying as much prepared meals, they're cooking more from scratch at home, now all of a sudden you uncover this need of, I don't have all the things in my kitchen to make this stuff. So a lot of Yappy Chef, a lot of ordering of small appliances, things to help people prepare food. And then you also had a lot of people searching for gym equipment. And in certain areas within South Africa, your Total Sports's, your Sportsman's warehouses were actually selling out in terms of people trying to set up their home environments so that they can do what they usually used to do when they went out. If we start looking at going forward, what's of most interest is which of these habits is going to stick. So big questions that we're looking at is, are people going to continue to put health front and foremost in terms of boosting their immune systems against the virus? Are people going to continue casual dressing? It's very interesting because people usually build their wardrobes around what they need the most. And you'll see a lot of comments coming through in terms of, well, I don't really have enough tracksuit pants and pajama bottoms and yoga pants. So, now people are having to wash these things more frequently, depending where they bought them from, the things start falling apart. So all of a sudden, what's in people's wardrobes starts to shift as well. So their need is now greater for more of a casual wardrobe. And a lot of people have now enjoyed the more casual dressing. So people are divided in terms of wanting to stay more casual or return to sort of a smarter form of dressing. So those kinds of trends in terms of exercising at home, prepping from scratch, what people are going to wear is something that needs to be monitored going forward. And I think a lot of business models are going to change because these new fitness platforms are also getting born. And why are people going to continue to pay for expensive gym memberships when now they've realized it's a lot easier and cheaper to do it in their own home? So for us, looking forward, it's given us an enormous amount of insights very quickly. I mean, this was turned around in 2 weeks. So very quickly understanding where customers were at and also the type of content that they wanted from us in terms of helping them through this. So it helped us from a brand in terms of being far more considerate of people's emotional space and what would actually help them. But going forward, we now also need to have a check of where are customers at now, because sentiment has swung quite drastically from pre-Easter. So we're actually going to be going in again. And that's the beauty of the bot. You can reprogram it quite quickly and do another dipstick, because you get a baseline, and then you can see how customers are progressing as they move through this period, which creates an invaluable dipstick in terms of where they're at and how we show up as a brand.
That's incredible, Charlene. I can't believe that turnaround. And well done to you and Kantar for putting that together. For a brand to have such a close relationship with their customers and to have those insights on hand that you can better serve their needs is fantastic.
Yep.
And thank you for all those insights. I think we'll certainly, even personally, be looking at some of the behaviors that we won't change. And
yep.
And sometimes we don't even realize how jarring it is when we're watching a movie that was obviously shot pre-COVID, and we see these behaviors and are quite startled by what we used to accept as status quo, and then now what those behaviors will look like going forward.
Yep.
I think one of the other interesting things is, I was chatting to someone yesterday about holding multiple states of mind at the same time. So you mentioned the COVID coaster, and sometimes it's probably one emotion preceding or coming after another one, and sometimes one almost holds those emotions at the same time. So we hold a state of hope for improvement and betterment of our current business context, but at the same time we need to be planning realistically and looking at those gaps for a protected future. So we're holding both headspaces at the same time, which I think is quite tricky. But
and I think and I think an important thing with that, especially when it comes to those headspaces and business models, all business models are going to have to change in some way. And I think, as you go into the space, and of course cash flow becomes issues, etc., you start looking at where you cut, where you can postpone to another time. But what you'll find is understanding where the customer is at the moment becomes even more important. And it becomes very, very important to understand their mind state right now and how you best show up and fulfill those needs. Interestingly enough, based on a lot of these customer comments, when we were first able to open up and start again trading in our clothing space, you could almost predict what was going to sell. And we could, based on what customers were saying they actually needed, what was foremost for them in terms of importance. So I think keeping a pulse in terms of where customers are at is very important, but even research methods are going to have to evolve. So you can still do some of these much longer term studies, fine, for certain things, like if you're going to do a packaging change or a price change, etc. But as you start bringing new products and new models to market, as you start wanting to understand how certain campaigns are going to perform, you can't afford to wait 8 weeks to understand how the market is going to respond. You need to look at more agile methods to get answers very quickly so that we as organizations can respond much faster in terms of what that evolving need is.
100%. I think that pace and understanding of the changes in those cycles is so important. Otherwise, we're not listening to our consumers, and they'll feel sort of misheard in that process. And I think that is what makes us brand strong, is that relationship and that understanding. And I think I like to use the words beauty of the bot. I think we could have a whole session on that. And I think that's quite a great statement. And utilizing that technology, to drive those insights quickly and with meaning. Because otherwise, like you said, or as Stina said earlier, there's a lot of information out there at the moment, and how do we sift through all of it to get to the part that's really going to, shift how we're working. So yeah, thank you. I don't know if anyone's got any questions for Charlene while she's on the line. I know in our last session with Natalie, one of our guests commented, I don't have any questions because they just covered everything so well. But if you don't have a question at the moment, you're more than welcome to email hello@iabsa.net or myself, and we can bridge you to the team and get those answers for you. But thank you so much, Charlene. We really appreciate your time, and I know a very, very busy schedule. And thank you for those insights.
Pleasure.
Great. And to Stina, I see I didn't put you on mute, so thank you for being so quiet.
Quietly here.
Just quietly. Thank you as well. And I think, even with Natalie's presentation last week, it's amazing to see, just how strengthening the basics really helps. So understanding your customer, that creative imperative, and using your customer insights to ensure your creative messaging is on track and true to your brand, the authenticity of a brand. You mentioned residual perception, your LucasAid example, which I thought was great. And I suppose most of us don't even realize that we're doing it. Or as Charlene pointed out, the cue of safety with masks, and probably picking shops, not necessarily to do with price, but the residual perception of safety becoming very important, and that association lasting much longer than the recession or these phases that are unfolding. I know Natalie also mentioned last week around, what we set up for our brand now. If we associate our brands with fear or with the wrong emotions, that's going to be very hard to undo in the times to come. So how we set up our brand and the perception that we're creating right now will impact us for a long time to come. So just a huge thank you for all those insights. I think one of the questions we did have was around the data. We saw clearly in some of the slides that it was, a slide from European data, but was most of the data shared specifically for South Africa out of the Kantar?
Yes, so there were some examples from global, but there's also the COVID barometer information in the deck. So specifically about how South Africans feel. So about the recession, on the slides where I mentioned that this is from our local South Africa barometer, how they feel about financial, if their financials has been impacted. So yes, there's lots of information in there from the latest barometer. And then we can also send you the Wave 3 barometer report if you would like to distribute that to everybody. That is the full report with all of the information.
Great, thanks. You're one step ahead. I see someone's asked if this presentation will be available, and we can share that in the thank you note along with the Wave 3 data, so people can get a really overall sense of what's happening there. I also see a question for Charlene. I don't know, Charlene, are you able to answer? Do you have time to answer a question?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks. The question I'll read directly is what the segment of the research, so it says, oh gosh, there's lots of questions here. I was wondering what the segment of the research consumers was. Was it Woolworths customers or the general public? And could you share a little bit more information about the demographic of the survey audience, I imagine?
So general public, we do look at a representation of Woolworths shoppers. So we run a tracker on a monthly basis, understanding what our penetration to the market is. So we mirror those penetrations to make sure we have some Woolworths shoppers in there, but it's our full target market. So it's 10,000 household income plus. I'm not a huge fan of LSM, so I suppose you could map it back to LSM 8, 9, 10. So that's basically who we looked at. And we looked at cross-section across age, across race, across income level, across geographic, all within that 10,000 household income plus mark.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks, Charlene. I'm just getting a whole lot of thank yous on the chat, so we're glad everyone enjoyed it and that the insights really landed well. A big thank you to Kantar and to Stina and to Charlene from Woolworths for a fantastic session. And we also, Stina or Charlene, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Not yet from my side. I think just as a word going forward, I think we need to continue to monitor very closely, because this is changing on a daily and a weekly basis. So what we know this week, it could change rapidly going into next week. It's not going to remain constant. So if we think we've got it cracked in terms of understanding where customers are at, what you think now is going to change very, very quickly.
Absolutely, and hopefully sessions like this can help us do that. I think, and maybe a question to both of you is, as the phases unfold and we correlate data potentially against the phases and potentially if they repeat themselves. So let's say the Western Cape is in phase 4 currently, and we move into phase 3 and then hopefully not, but back to phase 4. Do you think marketers or brands will be able to derive insights per phase or per cycle and be able to reapply those? Do you think we'll have some learnings that we can apply into the future Or do you think we don't know the answer yet?
I think we could as people go through phases, but the one complication I think we're going to have from a South African point of view is not everyone in South Africa is going to be in the same phase necessarily. Not everyone's going to be at the same level. So that's going to make things incredibly tricky in terms of how you show up for consumers and how you market to consumers if different provinces are at different levels at different points in time, because people's emotional state is going to vary. I think it's going to be interesting in terms of how different communities are going to respond to each other when one is in a more relaxed state versus another. So I think we can carry the learnings from one phase to another, but it is going to be qualified and changed now by different countries being at different states at the same point in time. So that could influence. So you might have all reacted one way under a level 4 because you were all in it together and you're all at the same level. But now if only 2 provinces are at level 4 and the rest relax to a 3 or a 2, how people are reacting and their emotional state in that level 4 might be slightly different, because it's not everyone is experiencing that same level of lockdown. And that sense of potentially powerlessness and a little bit of anger might be amplified. So we can take some of the learnings in, but we just need to be mindful that there'll be other factors that will now be influencing how people are feeling and responding.
So I think that, Charlene, it's very true what Charlene is saying. So you need to constantly keep a finger on the pulse of what your consumers are feeling and how they're behaving. If you think that you are a consumer-centric brand and you want to make sure that they pick you, you need to understand them, you need to be relevant, and you need to know what they're going through.
Great. Sorry if you heard me typing. I was just answering someone on the chat. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And really understanding how to segment databases and geolocated targeting for getting the right message to the right person, I think can help hopefully avoid some of those aggravations. But yes, as we all start to split out as a country, I think that's going to be another whole ball game to manage emotionally. And as brands, how can we help create a sense of continuity or control and safety? And like you say, we all need to keep online and hopefully some entertainment. I think with the 2 that I saw there, that we need to start helping with, I suppose, depending on the emotional state. Yeah, well, a huge thank you. I think for next week, I think it's going to be a great continuation of the session today. We have Lynn Gordon from Kantar South Africa, who will be sharing key shifts due to COVID implications for business leaders. So I think now that we've looked at creativity as one of the most important items or levers at this time of crisis as part of marketing and of being a strong brand, and we've looked today at how to look at some insights on brand recovery. Now, for the business leaders and for those of us who are aspiring business leaders to take that forward, I think as a third session, that's fantastic. And a big thank you to Kantar again for bringing that to the table. Right. We have officially ended our program today. A huge thank you, like I said, to Kantar and to Stina and to Charlene from Woolworths. If you've got any suggestions on topics that you'd like us to cover, please do send those through. And we'll be sharing the presentation along with the Wave 3 Kantar AME survey data in the thank you notes later today. All right, well, keep safe, keep sane, and stay in touch. Well, in touch. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.